When I finished uni, I moved back home until I found a job. As soon as I could afford to, I set up a profile on the website Spare Room. I was contacted by James. He had a room to rent on the outskirts of the town I worked in. It sounded good, but he wanted to talk on the phone before inviting me to view it. We had a chat one evening, and it turned out we had some things in common. We both enjoyed fitness, particularly swimming, and were both movie buffs. By the end of the call, it felt like I'd been chatting with an old friend, and I was looking forward to meeting him. James didn't specify his age, but I assumed he was in his 20s like me. When I went to view the property, he actually came out of the house next door to greet me. When he introduced himself as James, I was pretty shocked. He was at least 50, dressed quite conservatively, and looked like he was wearing a hairpiece. If he told me on the phone that he was in his early 20s, I wouldn't have questioned it. I went ahead with the viewing, but I already decided I didn't want to rent a room from him. I wanted to live with people who were a similar age to me. I was also put off by the house decor. It looked like it hadn't changed since the 80s. When I viewed the bedroom, it looked like it was occupied by a young person. There were several pairs of trainers and game consoles. James said that the previous tenant, Mark, was moving to London for work. Coincidentally, my name is Mark too. James invited me to sit in the living room after the house tour. I didn't want to be rude, so I did. He explained that he cared for his elderly mother who lived next door. Then, he started complimenting my style, saying I looked cool. He proceeded to put his hand on my leg, which made me feel really uncomfortable. When he asked if I was interested in the room, I said I had some other properties to view, but we would be in touch. I then made my excuses to leave. Everything about him screamed red flag. I just wanted to get out of that house. As soon as I was back in my car, I called my mom to tell her how freaked out I was and I would absolutely not be living there. James sent me a text a few days later to ask if I thought any more about moving in. I lied and said I'd found somewhere else closer to town. I did eventually find something with some other young professionals, which turned out to be great. Some months later, our town was shocked by the news that a man's body had been found in the fields on the outskirts. He was later identified as Mark. I didn't think much of it until I saw the murder suspect was his landlord. It was James. The same James whose house I viewed. I saw him on the news and got instant chills. He was later convicted of Mark's murder. The story takes place in the summer of 2017. My name is John, and I live in a rural part of Alabama, but I chose to work in the city. The drive is about 45 minutes or so, depending on traffic. However, by the time I pick up my son from the sitter, get dinner, and get home, I've been in the car for about an hour and a half. My house is surrounded by trees, and the neighbors are few and far between. It can be pretty lonely living out here, but I enjoy the privacy. One evening, I pulled in my driveway and noticed something odd. The doors on my storage shed were wide open. I told my son to sit in the car as I got out to investigate. I didn't see anything missing, so I closed the doors. I know the wind had not blown them open because it had 2 latches, and you have to open them in order to get it open. The next day I looked around, and much to my dismay, 2 weed eaters, along with a few other garden tools, were missing. I know I should have contacted the police, but I knew there wasn't much they could do at that point. Throughout the week, I had some time off and decided to tackle some yard work that I needed to get done, including cut down a medium-sized tree that had grown next to my house. Once it was cut down, it took everything I had to move it to the edge of my property, just inside the woods. I planned on cutting it up another day. Fast forward to the next Friday, I left work at 7 p.m., picked up my son, and we arrived home at 8:30 p.m. As I pulled in the driveway, my son and I noticed something laying across it. It looked as if a tree branch had fallen across my driveway. I drove up to it and I thought to myself, there's no trees over my driveway. Once I looked towards the base of the tree, My heart sank to the bottom of my stomach. It was the tree I had cut down. I had put it in clear on the other side of my property until I could cut it up. I recognized the markings from my chainsaw. I didn't really know what to do. My son and I sat there in silence for at least 5 minutes. I rolled the driver and passenger window down, just an inch to hear if anyone was around. I heard nothing. I then realized in order for me to get into my house, I would have to move the tree. I told my son I was going to get out to move it, just enough so we can get past. If anything happens, he can use my phone and call the neighbors who live the closest. I darted out of my car and moved the tree slightly and raced back to my car. I was terrified. Luckily, my son was on the ready to unlock the doors for me to get back in. I drove up towards my house and we got in safely. I did not sleep well that night. The next day, I woke up to find the tree was moved again, this time a few feet behind my car. To this day, I'm still baffled on who could have done this or what their intentions were. Next time, I will be smarter and call the police. And the other question that I have that I can't answer, how did someone know where I put the tree after I cut it down? Whoever had done this had been watching me. I had put the tree in the woods. That thought alone is enough to keep me up some nights. This past New Year's was mine and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle and wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub, and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get into it, you had to drive down a small, remote, private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill drive leading up to the cabin. We got to the cabin, and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on the top of a garage, and you needed to take the stairs to the back side of the property to get into the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all of the cabin info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. We unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne and hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got into the driveway. My boyfriend had stopped the car. His headlights were shining in front, and he asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks. Immediately, we remembered that the snowplowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones. So we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb hosts, and ask if they or one of their friends had stopped by the apartments. We waited for a while in town for a reply from the hosts, but didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point, it was past 10, and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion, and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime, spooky subreddits, and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. Towards the top of the hill part of the driveway, I noticed something. My stomach dropped. There was footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had driven up to the driveway, reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked onto the property. Since we had now also driven down the tracks, we couldn't find where the footprints end. The property was quite large, with tons of trees and brush, so we knew that these footprints could have gone anywhere. The moment we saw footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry. We would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up and we followed him onto the property. The police officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little shaken up and really embarrassed. We thanked the officer and he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after what had happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie, champagneless. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 3 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all of the lights, laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. It was the garage door. There was very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of our guest-occupied Airbnb at 3 in the morning. Like I said, we woke up to all of our lights on in the cabin, and there was lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew we were there, and they could easily see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911. We sat crouched in the Airbnb, praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony, as if someone threw something onto it. I was absolutely losing it when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search the property. As soon as we heard banging on the door, it was the police. We were okay. At the door were 2 policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around snow, looking at the ground. I noticed the police officer in the back was the same officer that did the initial check on the property. The police officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked. And again, there were no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the police officers said the road conditions were too dangerous at this time of night. I looked at the police officer who had come onto the property twice, and I felt that I deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, again locking all of the doors, and tried to sleep. The next day we were leaving, and while we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise we heard at 3 a.m. And it was the heater. A heater that sounds just like a garage, and the sounds last the same duration. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up on your murder shows," and he walked away, as if. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed falling pine cone. I promise I'm not that paranoid. I think back on the story a lot, and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but I'm also incredibly grateful for the same reason. But whoever drove onto the property and walked around, thank you for triggering all of my nightmares. Please stay home, and yeah, let's not meet again.